Brief U.S. History Review, Lesson 34, the Second World War. In many ways for the United States, the Second World War represented such a vastly transformational event. For instance, if you would have told someone in 1938 that just 6-7 years later, the United States would be the dominant economic colossus of the globe with the largest military, the only one with atomic weaponry, largest navy, massive military forces, booming economy, productive nation, they would have laughed at you. This was not who the United States was in the middle of this depression, and historically our involvement overseas had been minimalist with the exception of the First World War, minimalist at most. So the war is truly a transformational event. The country you live in today, that you as students take for granted as being the superpower with a worldwide impact and kind of reaching out and being able to, command events around the globe or deploy military forces around the globe, that nation did not exist. That's more unusual than usual. If you look at the long trend of American history, up until 1940, that was not us. That was not who we are. After 1940, the world you've lived in, that's who we've been in, that's who we've been ever since. So it's such a vastly important event to discuss in terms of the changes it brings to the United States, if not necessarily in terms of the tactics and strategy employed in winning the victory. That being said, we'll begin by looking just a little bit at winning that victory and how that victory is secured. The wartime relations, starting in there's two main theaters of operation, the European theater, the ETO, and the Pacific theater of operations, or the PTO. But in the European theater, wartime relations among the so-called Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, they ran hot and cold. When they needed each other the most, early in the war, is when the relations were closest. As it became more apparent that the Allies were going to win the war, misunderstandings and different interests sort of pulled that alliance apart a little bit. This would be realpolitik at work as well. The Allied leaders quickly learned as the war went on that military decisions were going to have political consequences, and where troops were deployed, the position of troops at the end of the war, might very well determine the nature of the governments that are established in the regions being occupied. The first initial fights, when these groups need each other most, weren't even fights. There was an awful lot of concert and harmony on what needed to happen. Stalin pushed as early and as quickly as he could for a second front to be opened in northwestern Europe. The reason being is that the Russians did most of the dying in World War II, to the tune of about 20 million. 20 million of their people were killed in the war, soldiers and civilians. Hitler's armies, after attacking the Soviet Union, got as far as almost the gates of Moscow, got as far as about right here in terms of taking over the Soviet Union, and the Russians in the early parts of the war were in many ways propped up in terms of their materials, their supplies, and industrial capacity by the production of the United States as America flexed its economic muscles, to do what the Axis could not do in two separate wars, to fight a two-front war. The United States was able to both supply the Soviet Union, supply our allies in Western Europe, and wage almost exclusively, except with Australian help, the war against the Japanese, and also help assist with the Chinese in that struggle in the war against the Japanese as well. So during this time, initially, the key battle that had to be fought was the so-called Battle of the Atlantic. Like World War I, the convoy system is essential to this struggle against the U-boats, trying to provide a strong defensive cordon that the U-boats can't penetrate as supplies go across the Atlantic to Great Britain or to the Soviet Union or underneath the Arabian Sea and through the Middle East into the Soviet Union to gain them their supplies. Now, with Russians doing most of the dying in World War II, the combination for victory is quite simple in many ways. American industrial capacity and technological know-how plus Russian blood equals defeat for the Axis. It's a very simple equation, but in that equation there's an awful lot of policy and money and human life wrapped up. The United States came off relatively light in terms of the casualties from the Second World War, about the same number we had near the Civil War, about 600,000 killed or wounded compared to 20 million for the Soviets. We played small in blood, relatively speaking, but we spent more than any other power. That was our thing. We paid big in dollars. And so with this being the case then, the first campaigns we engage in to try to take the pressure off for the Soviets, we first engage in the campaigns in North Africa, evicting the Germans from there, and then up through the Mediterranean into Sicily and Italy. But the real direct cross-channel invasion is the only significant advance, it's going to somehow minimize pressure on the Soviets, and then the Germans would be caught in a vice, caught in a true two-front war at that point in time. So a series of wartime conferences take place that are important for the layout of the strategy between the big three. The Casablanca Conference in North Africa in 1943 is where the Germany First policy is decided upon by the Allies. The Germans were seen as being the most dangerous of the Axis powers, and so to eliminate them first would be the equivalent, the metaphorical equivalent of breaking off the tip of the spear in terms of dealing with their opponents of the Allies. Secondly, the other thing that's agreed on there, largely to placate Joseph Stalin and the Russians, is unconditional surrender. In other words, there will be no armistice like after World War I. There will be no terms, because the Russians were worried that the United States, the Allies, the British and the Americans, might sign a separate peace with the Germans and leave the Germans free to fight the Russians all they wanted to. And to do so, to guarantee, to show good faith to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, all the Allies agreed on this model of unconditional surrender. The Axis powers will one at a time or collectively or however throw themselves on the mercy of the Allies, and the Allies at that point will decide what to do with them and what strategies need to be implemented. So it's an all or nothing strategy in many ways for this victory. Victory will be total and complete. There will be no negotiation. In the Tehran Conference of 1943, the Big Three finally agreed to launch Operation Overlord, the so-called D-Day operation, the Normandy invasion, the cross-channel invasion into France in the spring of 1944. By being able to do so in the European campaign, ultimately the Allies are able to prevail. They liberate France in August of 44. The Battle of the Bulge in Northwest Europe winds up being the most significant American military involvement and loss of life in the European theater. That's reversed. Hitler ultimately kills himself in his bunker in April or May of 1945, and the Germans surrender in May of that same month. As for the Pacific theater, as I'd kind of hinted at earlier, in the Pacific theater, the United States could largely count on minimal Allied support. The British were stretched to the limit, simply sustaining just the obligations of their empire and fighting for survival. The French had been directly occupied and don't even get reliberated until 1944, along with the Dutch and the Danes and the Norwegians and anyone else who had colonies around the world, specifically in Indochina. So other than the Australians, the Pacific theater is going to be largely an American show. The green bordered line here represents the maximal extent of Japanese conquest in the early years of the war post-Pearl Harbor. Now, with the fall of the Philippines, we ultimately do lose our outposts in the Philippines. We lose Wake Island, we lose Guam, we lose our Philippine holdings, and this represents, with the Bataan Death March, the largest military defeat in American history, at least of the United States Army, their single biggest surrender, mass surrender of American troops, which they couldn't hold out any longer. Now, at that point in time, we began a policy gradually going over the initiative. The war in the Pacific, unlike Europe, is going to be a war of distance. It's going to be a war of aviation. It'll be an aircraft carrier war. It'll be a war of this so-called island hopping strategy of going from point to point. The Japanese held this massive defensive perimeter, presuming that we'd have to take over all the islands to get back. What we did is we selectively vaulted the various garrisons and took them over, bypassing others, leaving them to wither and die on the vine, for a decent metaphor, as we headed closer and closer to Japan. We sent some forces through New Guinea up into the Philippines, other forces through the island chains working up towards Japan, getting close enough to then directly bomb Japan in preparation for an invasion of the Japanese homeland itself. Now, as the United States got closer, the Japanese became increasingly desperate and fanatical in their resistance. By 1944, you see the advent of the so-called kamikaze or divine wind attack, where Japanese pilots, as suicide pilots, would ram their planes directly into American ships, killing themselves and doing as much damage to the vessels as possible, turning their aircraft into essentially giant guided missiles. It's this kind of fanaticism that in many ways leads the United States to wonder about the wisdom of a conventional invasion of Japan. The so-called Operation Olympic, which was going to be the invasion of Japan conventionally, was forecast to cost up to 1 million American casualties. And at this point, the largest big secret operation in the war for the United States, the Manhattan Project, successfully develops the world's first nuclear reaction, the first atomic bomb. This weapon is then dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as you've read about in numerous accounts in your history work. And after this, the Japanese are compelled to surrender. And they, too, submit to unconditional surrender along this model. Now, in terms of the effect of the war at home, The war transformed America psychologically and emotionally and economically and socially. The war stands as a threshold, one of those massive events like the Civil War, where everything before it is different than everything after it. And I kind of referenced that in my initial remarks today on this lesson in many ways. It's a dividing point in American history. All that followed it would be different from all that came before. And as with every war you've got this linkage, this common theme of governmental power expanding. Every American war, without exception, has witnessed the expansion of federal authority and powers. The Civil War did, World War I did, even to a certain extent the War of 1812 did. But World War II is the big one in that regard in many ways. The New Deal programs were largely stopped or rolled back. Winning the war replaced the New Deal, and besides, the economic downturn that the New Deal had to fix, that went away the moment that you had warfare, because now you had 100% employment. You actually had underemployment. We had more jobs than people to fill them. And as such, we had once again, like the First World War, what we called war socialism. The government actively managed the economy on a somewhat command basis, in order to coordinate the war effort. The War Production Board allocated resources and defined production schedules. The Office of War Mobilization took care of essentially getting employees and people to those that needed them for production when necessary, shuttling people and employees around the country as were necessary for needs of very specific war plans. Office of War Information coordinated all the information from the war, and the idea was to present an image of the war to the American people that was always, we're going to be victorious, it's upbeat, it's cheery, and war propaganda was everywhere during this time to try to advance this model of we are all in this together. Also, like the First World War in some ways, the Office of Price Administration set prices, and more of a link to the First World War. The National War Labor Board had the same name as the one from World War I, was set up to essentially have a no-strike pledge and make sure that labor and management worked at maximum capacity all throughout this period of time. Now, the Office of Price Administration set prices to try to keep inflation from getting out of hand. Because remember, no one's making consumer goods anymore. Prices would skyrocket unless the government, in a command economy model, set prices, which it then proceeded to do. Now, what World War II did do is it actually redistributed some of the national wealth from the wealthy to everyone else. This is what the New Deal was supposed to do and didn't do. The New Deal did not cure the Great Depression. World War II ends the Great Depression. World War II winds up being Keynesian economics, Keynesian government spending on a massive scale, a scale that eclipsed everything the New Deal attempted to do. So as such, that's what lifts the Americans out of this Great Depression during this time. Smith-Connolly Act also comes in forbidding